So my name, again, is Becca Edwards. I'm the Climate Action Fellow at Texas Impact, and also half of my job is with the General Board of Church and Society of the UMC. And I do climate work with them too. So it's a really nice arrangement because climate change policy spans policy at the local, state, federal, and international levels, which I hope that you will understand more about after this presentation. So first question, hopefully because you're in here, oh, where'd it go? All right, got it. So my question is, this is not an answer out loud question because we don't have time, unfortunately. I wish we did. But do you think climate change is an important issue? And the reason I ask that, yeah, kind of the impression in here is yes. Yes, okay. That's why you're here. Yes, that's why you're here. But the reason I ask is because I've had conversations with people in churches that don't understand that this is an important issue, or they feel like it's too political of an issue to be concerned with in our congregations. But what is interesting is that this is the result of the Yale Climate Communication Study, which is a study that's done periodically on opinions and attitudes related to climate change in the United States. And what we know is that despite kind of the impression that not a lot of people are talking about this, it's actually true that the majority of people in the US are concerned about climate change. And this report was released in September based on data that's been collected over the last couple of years. But I would imagine that if you took this poll immediately after this last summer, that the results would probably indicate that even more people are concerned about climate change. But I show this to people in church settings because I think it's reassuring. And I think people that feel scared to bring up this topic with their friends and neighbors might like to know that they're in good company if they're concerned about climate change. And the reason that's helpful is because talking about climate change with our friends and neighbors and striking up conversations while you're waiting for an oil change and that sort of thing is one way that we can all move this conversation forward. So don't try to read this whole thing, but I wanted to ground this by talking about the United Methodist Church's position on climate change. Like I said, part of my role is with the General Board of Church and Society, so I started with the social principles. And there are two parts of the social principles that speak directly to the issue of climate change. One is energy resources utilization, and I'll let you read this later, but it talks about measures to save energy, use energy responsibly, to limit our CO2 emissions because of the damage that it causes to the climate, and that sort of thing. The second thing is a section called Global Climate Stewardship, which speaks directly to greenhouse gas emissions and the need to reduce them because of the way that alters climate. It also talks about the disproportionate impact of climate change on people around the world who are less able to adapt to climate change than we are in the US, and also those same people who are less responsible for the problem of climate change than we are in the US. So our social principles take a nice clear stand on the issue of climate change, which I think is great. And even more fundamentally, when I think about climate change, I look to the Gospels, to the call to love our neighbor. And I think that caring for our climate and creating a world that people can live in with health and dignity is an important way that we can care for our neighbors. And that means that we can work for policy that reduces climate change so that we can have that world more quickly. So let's talk about how climate change affects our neighbors. As I mentioned, climate change affects everyone on Earth, but the most severe impacts are borne by those who are already marginalized. So for example, this summer when we had extreme temperatures in Texas of like days over 109 degrees here in central Texas, that was extremely unpleasant. Those temperatures are, by the way, dangerous. And that was unpleasant for me, but I was able to protect myself because I have a house with air conditioning and I have a vehicle and I work in an office building. But that's not true for everybody that we live around. So when I say that climate change impacts are worse for those who are least able to adapt, I'm thinking of our unhoused neighbors, our neighbors who work outdoors, and those without access to a vehicle or indoor housing. So this makes this a really fundamental justice issue for people of faith. Another reason that I think climate change is a really important issue for people, for church members and church leadership, is that the church's mission work, which we have a wonderful history of fruitful and faithful mission work, both domestically and internationally, and that work includes work in sectors that are affected by climate change. So work that involves agriculture, work that involves water, so digging wells, work that involves public health, work that involves immigration and migration, and ministry among unhoused people. All of these areas are affected by climate change, and the effects of climate change make it so that if we don't understand them well, we can't prepare adequately for the future of mission and the future of ministry. So we need to be thinking about these issues strategically in our mission planning. A more recent issue is that the way climate change has affected some financial products means that churches are impacted financially. I know some of you who are in leadership in Methodist churches in Texas may have had experienced this most recent, well, I said semester, but we don't think in semesters anymore, this fall, with a change in the way property taxes, property insurance is handled. I know in my own district, property insurance used to be handled as a group, but because of changes in the amount of, because there's been so many claims in Texas due to natural disasters, which is an impact of climate change, they've changed the way we do our property insurance. And some churches are experiencing very significant increases in their property insurance premiums, which affects the budget, it affects the way they hire and retain staff, and it affects ultimately the way we engage in ministry. So climate change is one of those insidious problems that's starting to affect us all in ways big and small, and ways that go way beyond the scientific problem of changing climate. So we're gonna go very quickly through climate change policy, all the way from international policy down to local. And I realize that this is really quick for this topic. If we had like a week, we could probably cover it all very carefully. But I'll do my best to explain it. We'll have time for questions at the end. But as I mentioned, this is a problem that spans all different levels of policy, and so it's important to understand them as a whole when we go advocate at the Capitol. First, we're going to talk about the Conference of the Parties, or COP. COP is an international gathering held by the UN. The parties in the name Conference of the Parties refer to the individual countries that were part of the original United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which you've probably heard abbreviated UNFCCC. And the purpose of the gathering is to talk about progress that has been made on climate change goals and make plans for the future. So every COP has a slightly different focus, but that's the general goal for each one. So I'm going to talk real quickly about some language that I'll be using throughout this presentation so we all are on the same page, as COP has a very specific vocabulary. The first is the Paris Agreement, which you may have heard of, probably. The United States is part of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was an agreement signed during COP21 in Paris, and that is the time when we, as a global community, decided that 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels was the goal for limiting global warming. We are currently sitting at about 1.1 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels, so not much more room. But what scientists now agree on, that 1.5 degrees Celsius is a more appropriate goal to reduce our risk of the worst climate impacts. Nationally determined contributions that is the term that describes what each country says is its goal for reducing emissions and for adapting to climate change. So each country sets a goal and then tries to meet it over the next few years. Adaptation is the word that describes how countries or how people adapt to climate change impacts that have already happened. So for example, if you are dealing with sea level rise, you might build a seawall. That would be an adaptation project. In some parts of the world, they plant mangroves as a way to reduce the impacts of sea level rise. That's another kind of adaptation. Next is mitigation, and so that describes any effort to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases or otherwise prevent future climate change. So the big one is reducing emissions. Ambition is just what it sounds like. How ambitious are your nationally determined contributions? So how ambitious are your goals for reducing future climate change? And then the stock take. So this year's COP focused primarily, or one of the big focuses was this document called the stock take. And so the stock take is a process that was outlined in the Paris Agreement where each party assesses its progress towards its goal, that its nationally determined contribution. So each party assesses its progress, and then as a global body, we assess the progress that has been made overall and how much more progress must be made to reach our goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's just what it sounds like. It's a taking stock of where we are, how far we've come, and where we need to be. So countries and parties submitted their progress, then they drew up a document with future recommendations, and that was much of the negotiations at this year's COP in Dubai. So that was kind of quick, but the thing I want to focus on the most is the idea of climate finance. So climate finance simply is developed nations providing financial support for developing nations to meet their mitigation and adaptation goals. So it sounds simple, but there's a lot of it's an attempt to address the underlying injustice of climate change that developed nations like the US have benefited from fossil fuel emissions in many, many ways over the last 100 years. So it is unjust to ask developing nations to stop recovering fossil fuels without providing a financial incentive. So this climate finance, it's a justice issue, but it's also a very practical issue. Because developing nations use the resources and the financial benefits of recovering fossil fuels, they use money for many different goals, many of which are humanitarian in nature. So eradicating poverty, adapting to climate change impacts, and that sort of thing. So climate finance is one way to support that work and enable them to reduce their emissions of fossil fuels, which is what we all need to do to limit the effects of climate, or to mitigate future climate change. So it's both an ethical and a practical reality. It's why we need climate finance. COP28, which we just had in Dubai, can be thought of as part of a sequence. In COP27 last year, the loss and damage, which is the name for the fund that sets up the fund for climate finance, they decided to move forward exploring how to implement that. At this year's COP, the big focus was the stock take. And putting those two things together, both the finance piece and the understanding where we are and where we need to be, will go into the conversation at the next COP, which is when we develop our plans and our commitments for each party going forward. So you can see how those two pieces need to be in place before countries can make ambitious goals for mitigation and adaptation going forward. So that was a Mad Lib of climate finance and COP terms. I hope it's not too bad. So you might be asking yourself, why should Texas voters be informed about international climate policy? Especially, Josh talked to us about how local politics is how important it is, and that is true. But I hope to show you that all of these climate policy issues kind of go together and they work together as part of a whole. So this is why we should be informed about international climate policy. Number one, Texas is at risk from many climate impacts. We have a long coastline, so we are at risk from sea level rise and hurricanes. We have blizzards, we have extreme cold, extreme heat, we have droughts, we have vector-borne disease coming from Central America, which is enhanced by climate change. We have an international border, so we deal with migration and immigration. We have severe weather and tornadoes. We have basically every kind of climate impact you can think of. Texas has some kind of impact from it. And so international climate policy is the way that we work to reduce climate change, and Texas has a vested interest in that going forward. Second reason is that Texas is an energy producing state. Significant amount of the state's revenue comes from fossil fuel recovery. We have all three: coal, petroleum, and natural gas in our portfolio. And decisions that we make on the state level and a local level related to fossil fuel recovery have an impact on the way the United States is able to commit to climate change mitigation. So it's an important issue for us, for sure. The third reason Texas voters should be informed about international climate policy is that ambitious, nationally determined contributions and climate finance contributions require the support of Congress. So the way we have it set up, the way our appropriations process is set up in the United States is that our negotiators at COP and other forums are not able to make any kind of commitment that won't be supported by the federal appropriations process in Congress, which means that we need to advocate with our federal lawmakers about why this is important to us and why it should be important to them. Not working. Oh, now it's going to do like 5 at once, isn't it? So another reason that Texans should be concerned about climate policy is that climate change mitigation benefits everybody. It goes so far beyond specific climate impacts. And changes that we make to mitigate our emissions benefit us in many other ways. One big one is air quality. So emission or burning of fossil fuels doesn't just release carbon dioxide. Recovery of fossil fuels releases different kinds of air pollutants like methane and VOCs. Burning fossil fuels releases sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, volatile organic compounds. All of those contribute to poor air quality, which causes health impacts for the very young, the very old, and people who are medically vulnerable. Secondly, adding more renewable energy to our portfolio reduces energy cost, which benefits all of us. It also distributes our energy generation over a larger area, which makes us less vulnerable to problems during extreme weather. So in addition to making our energy more affordable, renewables can make our energy more reliable as well. Third, transitions like attention to making public transportation more convenient and more accessible benefits people who aren't able to drive a car or aren't able or aren't interested in maintaining a personal vehicle. I know that I have a car, my husband has a car, but we are very dependent on them. There are no alternatives if one of our cars goes bad. So you probably had the same experience. If we focus on public transportation options as a means of reducing our emissions, that improves both air quality and also improves access and mobility around our cities. So let's talk about some specific advocacy opportunities on the state and local level, since we're going to be at the Capitol on Wednesday. Excuse me, one second. A big issue in the 88th session was energy. Some of the policy that was passed during that session was an improvement, and some was not what we hoped. But renewable energy is something that we want to support, something we hope to see more of. Texas is a leader in renewable energy. We're number 1 for wind generation. We're number 1 or 2 for solar generation. I just saw on Twitter that today solar generated 30% of our electricity needs, which is great news. All of that helps improve our reliability and reduce our emissions. Battery storage is a technology that allows us to store energy generated by renewables like solar and wind to have available when those resources are not available, so like at night and when it's not as windy. Energy efficiency is a big one. So energy efficiency projects improve the insulation of our buildings and also support things like more efficient appliances. And this is an approach that has a lot of benefits, because one is reducing the demand on our electrical grid, which improves reliability. It reduces emissions, and it also brings down cost for the individual consumer, as well as making our houses more comfortable during hot and cold weather. Demand response refers to the practice of asking people to reduce their use of electricity during periods of intense electrical demand. So you've probably heard those calls from ERCOT and the utilities saying, use less energy this afternoon because we're going to be very tight with our demand. So demand response, an organized policy-based demand response program would make that more organized and more efficient. There's ideas that you could be incentivized by your electric utility to reduce your electrical need during those periods of demand, which would feel a lot better than just being told when I can use my dryer, right? A second area of policy concern is environmental quality. We didn't have time to really get into methane too much, but methane is a greenhouse gas, just like carbon dioxide. It's actually better at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. It is released during oil and gas operations. It is flared, so if you're down on the coastal plain and you see those flares, that's methane. We had some wins policy-wise this year. The EPA passed really strong regulations about methane. It's working to eliminate flaring, which would be great. But we still have lots of methane leaks and places that we can clean up our methane emissions, which would provide an immediate climate benefit. So one thing Texans can do is to support the EPA's regulations on methane and let your lawmakers know that you support those regulations, because sometimes what happens is the EPA passes something like this and then Texans resist because we are so dependent on fossil fuels for our economy. Another advocacy opportunity is to work for better access and better convenience related to public transportation. So improving bus networks, installing light rail, thinking creatively about how we can make our cities more accessible without cars. And again, all of these things have many benefits: air quality, congestion, convenience, cost. So these policies are very sensible and also help us with our climate goals. At the federal level, this is currently happening. The EPA is able to regulate greenhouse gases as an air pollutant, and that kind of comes and goes depending on the administration. So supporting that kind of regulation is one opportunity. The Farm Bill is a massive package of legislation that affects everything from food prices to the way farmers fertilize and harvest their crops. That bill is up for renewal every 5 years. It was supposed to be renewed in 2023. There was no agreement on a new farm bill, so the current farm bill was extended for another year. But in that year, we are advocating for better climate provisions and climate smart agriculture. So at the federal level, that's one thing we support. We also support ambitious and generous funding to climate finance. And there's two main mechanisms for that. The Loss and Damage Fund, which was established and funded at this year's COP, as well as the Green Climate Fund, which has been around a little bit longer. And again, it requires the support of Congress through the appropriations process, so that's one way we can advocate as Texans. And we can also support the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed a couple years ago by the Biden administration. It has multiple climate provisions, energy efficiency improvements, incentives for installing renewables in homes, businesses, and nonprofits. And it's one that is at risk during the appropriations process because those who oppose those provisions will sometimes attach riders to must-pass bills to weaken the IRA. So letting your lawmakers know that you support the IRA and that you're happy that it passed and you plan to take advantage of its provisions is another way we can advocate at the federal level. Recently, there has been progress on the liquefied natural gas front. So really quickly, liquefied natural gas is just natural gas that is condensed into the liquid form, loaded onto ships, and then exported. It has become an issue recently because now that Russia is not able to export natural gas, Europe is having to get that gas in other places, and one of those places is the US. And the US is currently, I think, either the top or one of the top exporters of liquefied natural gas. Natural gas, it's sometimes thought of as a safer alternative to coal when it comes to climate, but recent research has found that because of the way methane leaks during all parts of the process from drilling to transport to any kind of industrial process, those leaks make up such a big contribution to greenhouse gases that it's actually about the same environmental impact as coal. So because we already have significant liquefied natural gas export capabilities, and that will not go away, but what recently happened, was that yesterday or the day before? Day before yesterday is the Biden administration paused permits for new liquefied natural gas facilities, which is great news because new facilities just increase our infrastructure for emitting carbon dioxide and methane going forward. So reducing those is one big way that the US can be a leader and show the international community that we are serious about the commitments we made during COP to begin working towards a phase down or phase out of fossil fuels. Can't phase it out if you're still building new things for it, right? So that is a win. It's a pause, though, not a stop. So there continues to be the need for advocacy for saying, yes, we support this, providing some cover for our lawmakers that support these things as well.